مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. الحرب التي اندلعت الخميس ضد أوكرانيا ستطلق العنان للعديد من الاتجاهات العالمية، لأن روسيا بلد مهم، ومن خلال مهاجمتها لأوكرانيا فهي لا تهاجم فقط بلدا يبلغ عدد سكانه 40 مليون نسمة، بل إنها تزيد أيضا من التوترات بين روسيا والغرب. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف تنضم إلينا كارولين كبيرة الباحثين في معهد نيولاينز للدراسات السياسية. سيدة كارولين، مرحبا بك معنا.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
الغرب تحدث عن الحرب لأسابيع الآن، لكن عندما حدثت بالفعل الجميع انصدم. ما تفسيرك؟
Well, certainly this has been an interesting situation where we've had weeks, even in some cases months of anticipation and incremental buildup right outside of Ukraine. But still, of course, the events last night in the offensive, nothing could really prepare the international community for what was about to happen. Certainly we're already starting to see the effects of a humanitarian crisis, a migrant overspill, and then of course, mass casualties in Ukraine. I think that certainly the timing has a lot to do, of course, with Russia's geopolitical position, but then also, of course, the sense that now was somehow the time to strike when the iron was hot, and that incremental buildup, despite any kind of lack of diplomatic success or diplomatic achievement through de-escalation, that was the time that Russia felt very cornered to launch an offensive.
الآن بعد أن بدأت الحرب، ما السيناريوهات المتوقعة في أوكرانيا على الأرض؟ احتلال، محاولة لتغيير النظام، محاصرة كييف، الاستسلام أم ماذا؟
That's a great question. And I think that last night came a bit of a surprise, given the attacks on key command nodes and logistical centers outside of eastern Ukraine. And it certainly does suggest that it is possible that Russia could consolidate territory outside of the DPR and LPR. I think that there are a number of different scenarios. Certainly is that they keep to the east and they annex this territory or try and induce a regime change, trying to, of course, topple the existing regime in Kiev, the capital. Also, a potential scenario, of course, is consolidating parts of Ukraine further west. And so perhaps taking the capital, taking parts of the east, and creating Ukraine and fashioning it into a frozen conflict and a power vacuum. I think that could be possible. I think that the most likely outcome is certainly Russia consolidating eastern Ukraine and then keeping Kiev and using that as a negotiating tactic with the West.
هل فشلت سياسة الردع بالعقوبات الغربية، أم أن العقوبات التي تم الإعلان عنها لم تكن مؤلمة بما فيه الكفاية لروسيا؟
I think that Russia conducted this campaign acknowledging that sanctions were going to happen, and they're accepting this risk of increased sanctions. We had the sanctions that came before the offensive, and now we have, of course, a round of sanctions that will likely be announced today and later this week on Russia. I think that certainly this will cripple the Russian economy and Russian capabilities and operational capacity in the long term. There's just so much economic devastation that they can take. For example, the stock market has been absolutely shattered. And then also, of course, Russia's economic position was already precarious to begin with. That doesn't necessarily mean that sanctions imposed by the West have failed. I think that in the long term, they may stunt Russian action, but I don't think that they've done too much to stunt Russian short-term offensive in Ukraine. And so I think that also, diplomatic engagement hasn't necessarily been successful either.
سأشرح لك أكثر لماذا سألت السؤال، لأنه هناك بعض المحللين يدفعون بفكرة مفادها أن أي عقوبات لتكون مؤثرة ومؤلمة على روسيا يجب أن تستهدف مجال الطاقة، وكذلك يجب أن تستهدف فصل موسكو عن النظام المالي العالمي. ما رأيك؟
I think that it's certainly being considered and could be effective. I think that, there are a lot of sanctions that haven't been enacted. For example, today and yesterday, there were a lot of calls for sanctions affiliated with SWIFT. And I also think that, sanctions on Russia's oil sector Also, of course, the series of oligarchs that are implicated in such an industry and sector. I think that that also could be effective as well. But again, I think that the calculus really is going to be, what can we do? What can the West do that can incapacitate Russia in the short term and stop this territorial violation and this jeopardization of human security?
في هذا السياق الذي تتحدثين عنه، هل هناك عقوبات مفعولها أو تأثيرها أسرع؟
That's a great question. Outside of sanctions, I think today we're going to see a series of really harsh sanctions on the oil sector, on these oligarchs that I mentioned. Also, of course, companies that are operating in the DPR and the LPR. But I also think that today there's going to be a very vital discussion on what NATO can do, what is in NATO's capacity. Because Ukraine is not a NATO member, Article 5 is essentially not a possibility, but there has been discussion of Article 4 being invoked by NATO, which would essentially be voluntary assistance to Ukraine in any shape or form. And so I think that likely what we may start to see is a series of NATO members, particularly in Eastern Europe, essentially volunteer to send forces, personnel, equipment, assistance to Ukraine to essentially buffer and bolster their effectiveness against Russian forces. Still, though, I'm not necessarily sure how successful it can be, just given the operational strength and advantage that Russia does have in Ukraine, also, of course, with Belarusian forces.
كارولين، تحدثت عن استهداف النخب الروسية، الأوليغارشية الروسية، تحديدا الدائرة المقربة من بوتين وأملاك هذه الدائرة في الغرب. هل هذا قانوني أساسا؟ هذه الشخصيات ليس لديها وظائف رسمية.
I don't think it's illegal. I think, the United States and its EU counterparts have imposed sanctions like this before, not only necessarily in Russia, but also, of course, on a number of other adversaries, and they have proven effective. Really, I think that when constructing these sanctions campaigns and these sanctions regimes, it's important to ask, how it can be effective, and if the individuals that are being targeted, what's the end goal? What is the end objective? And if that is to cripple the Russian economy at large, if that is to, for example, fracture inside internal consensus within the Kremlin, that it very possibly could be effective. But we still don't know what the sanctions package looks like and the very specific details. I think that later today we may get a better idea. And, I do think, though, that there are a number of different contingency plans that the United States and its allies have consulted and agreed upon before this offensive even began, just because of the heads up and the notice that we had ahead of time.
باعتقادك لماذا بدا الغرب في الفترة الماضية وكأنه غير جاد أو غير متحد في فرض عقوبات على روسيا؟
Well, I think today we're going to see quite a bit of unity. I certainly, before we did see some difference in opinion, of course, in assisting Ukraine. There was some fragmentation between, for example, Germany and other EU states in trying to allow assistance to go through, opening corridors for humanitarian aid and, of course, military assistance. But I think today we're starting to see a turnaround. For example, Germany made a major announcement yesterday, which, of course, was stalling Nord Stream 2. And, that was something that was quite a huge policy pivot for Germany. And so I think today we're going to see very much a high level of inter-EU and transatlantic unity between the United States, EU, and NATO, in, of course, supporting Ukraine, in denouncing the Russian invasion, and then, of course, trying to achieve de-escalation and permanent peace.
حتى الآن تبدو وكأن ألمانيا هي من ستدفع فاتورة التوتر أو أكبر فاتورة بعد شجاعتها لوقف خط الأنابيب مع روسيا. احتياطاتها من الغاز تكفيها فقط ل90 يوما، ناهيك عن أزمة النازحين والمساعدات الإنسانية. كيف سيتدبر الغرب مساعداته؟ كيف سيرتبها لإيصالها لأوكرانيا وجيرانها؟
It's a great question. And I think that this should be the question of this week, really. We're going to talk about, the economic punitive measures that we can impose on Russia. We'll talk about the military punitive measures that could be imposed. But there really is not a big discussion about some of the humanitarian spillover effects that this crisis will create in Eastern Europe and in other areas of Eastern Europe, the Baltics, and even in some cases Central Asia. I think there's going to be a huge migrant overspill from this crisis. We've seen, the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine report a number of casualties. We still haven't really seen the breakdown between civilians and military casualties. We have evidence right now that a number of Ukrainians are hiding in their basements or in some cases in subways just out of fear of, bombings and just widespread devastation. And so I think certainly we're starting to already see a huge diaspora of Ukrainians leaving key urban centers and trying to just to get out of the country, just given that Russia is targeting a number of cities, both in East and Western Ukraine. And so I think that definitely this is going to be a high priority item. How does the West facilitate humanitarian assistance? How do we help countries like Germany and other destination countries help host these refugees and give them adequate care, both physical and psychological care, medical care as well? And how do we assist, really? I think that's going to be a key question. We have not seen any kind of plan just yet, but I'm sure the United States and its partners have discussed this and have discussed contingency plans.
تحدث بوتين عن إسلاميين يقاتلون على الجانب الأوكراني. البعض يقول إنه سيكون هناك شيشان في الجانب الموالي لروسيا. هل هناك مكون إسلامي يتبلور لينضم بشكل ما إلى الصراع؟
Yes, the Monday speech featured a number of different ideological elements that I think, was confusing in some ways, but if you've read a lot of Putin's prior work and essays on Russian foreign policy, this is building upon a kind of a long-term arc that he's created that's trying to essentially shroud and essentially blame Ukraine and pin it as a fascist, Nazi, Islamist country. That all of the different elements don't necessarily make sense, but that is the justification that they're using. I've also seen a number of justifications for this war as an emergency rescue operation to rescue separatists and to rescue Ukraine. And again, of course, they've said that this is a training exercise, but really then it turned into an offensive. So, I think that we're going to see a number of different allegations that Moscow is trying to mount on this offensive, but we're seeing it under many different names.
الصين اليوم أعلنت دعمها لروسيا بطريقة أو بأخرى. هل كان ذلك متوقعاً؟
Well, definitely China has now really come out and supported this operation and offensive in Ukraine. For China, for them, it's about trying to stave a Cold War mentality between the United States and its adversaries, but at the same time supporting an operation that it doesn't really get much more Cold War than this. Certainly a lot of this situation has reminded a lot of analysts and experts of days in the Cold War where these operations would be launched by the Soviet Union. And so I think that certainly this is a case in point in that China is supporting Russia against the West as a stand against NATO expansion. And of course, I think will try and uphold this argument as well for their own gains in Taiwan and the South China Sea.
ماذا عن تركيا؟ تربطها علاقات اقتصادية ضخمة مع أوكرانيا ناهيك عن التزامها تجاه الناتو، لكنها في الوقت نفسه لديها علاقات اقتصادية كبيرة مع موسكو. هل تعتقدين أنها ستغلق البوسفور؟ فقط للتذكير، في عام 2014 لم تشارك تركيا في العقوبات على روسيا بعد استيلائها على القرم.
I think that thus far we haven't seen a decision made by Ankara on whether to, of course, to close the Bosphorus. Turkey has come out and supported, the case of Ukraine, and they have condemned the Russian offensive. I think that in itself is very important to note. I think that after some meetings between ministers of NATO today and backdoor discussions, we may see a few more moves enacted by Turkey to counter this. But we haven't seen anything yet with the Bosphorus, but I wouldn't discount it in the future. I think that certainly, Turkey has chosen the side of Ukraine. They've deployed a number of different forms of military assistance to Ukraine, as you noted. And I think that for them, it's going to be very crucial that Ukraine, essentially tries to resist this offensive as long as they can.
سؤالي الأخير كارولين عن احتمالات المواجهة أو تصعيد المواجهة بين الولايات المتحدة وروسيا حتى لو لم تكن هناك قوات أمريكية على الأرض في أوكرانيا؟
I think that with any kind of large scale escalation like we're seeing, with just so much personnel and so much equipment, and of course tensions are high, there is always the case of a mistake or friendly fire or just a mishap that absolutely could change the course and change up the different scenarios that we could see in Ukraine. With that, of course, I think that the United States is trying as careful as it can, as cautiously as it can, to try and avoid any kind of indirect or direct engagement between US forces and also NATO forces at large. I think that the calls for invoking Article 4, I'm not necessarily sure how the United States is going to try and handle that, just because it then can very easily spill into direct escalation and direct confrontation. But of course, you can't discount that. It's very possible that we could see another flashpoint in Poland, or between Poland and Belarus, or between Russian forces and another flashpoint in Eastern Europe along the Russian Western periphery. It's very possible. So definitely, it's a cause for concern for analysts and experts.
كارولين روز، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق. مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.